remember waking up early just to catch your favorite cartoons? WESN brings back those magical mornings with Retro Saturdays.
Thus, the Powerpuff Girls were born!
Where the young at heart relive the fun. Join us every Saturday from 8 a.m. to 12 noon, only on WESN, the content capital.
In this day of stay at home and work from home, home has never meant more than it does today. Whether you're looking to buy, rent, or build your new home, now is the time to get going. Gittins & Gittins real estate agents are here to take you to that place of your dreams. Let us take you home. We help you find that rental to rest along the way or journey with you to find your home destination. Investors and commercial enterprises too, call us and we'll walk the distance to place your business in just the right location. Owners, leave the headaches to us. We'll find your tenants or buyers while you stay at home. We'll even manage your property at your bidding. Anything real estate, come home to Gittins & Gittins Real Estate. Call us at 760-3280 or 747-1220 or visit us at 16 Fifth Street in Woodbrook.
WESN.
Morning, Sean Michael Small. This is Talking Point, here on WSN, the content capital. And, oh boy, had a long discussion yesterday, and we are set to continue that discussion, but it won't dominate the whole show. It can't. I would argue, while an important topic, two things. One, the direct relevance to us is limited, not non-existent, but limited. There are other things to talk about. And two, I don't necessarily want to drag the conversation out for too long. However, we were contacted by someone yesterday who would have preferred a greater chance to explain themselves, which, funny enough, this might be an example where I have two different people who disagree with each other, but they might agree in at least one aspect of the topic that I disagree with them. So it's not actually a two-sided debate. One could argue it's a three-sided debate in a way. That said, we'll get into that later. Before we get into that, now, we have gotten news with regards to the commissioner's absence. It's very interesting. It's very interesting that he was selected for this. And I do find, once again, now, this is where you can argue that how they handled his absence and communicated it to the public is a bit more reasonable. I was operating on the assumption emergency leave, maybe it's something personal. It's apparently not something personal. Although, and this might sound really bad, you could have still said that as cover for an official situation that seemingly requires some amount of secrecy and or discretion. I would have understood. I don't know if other people would have understood, but I would have understood. Again, why? Because the goal is managing the nation's expectations. And on some level, the commissioner might want to complain about the speculation, but he needs to understand that this is human behavior that could have been predicted. So at the very least, don't complain about it, right? Understand that it's a natural response. So the commission has said that via voice notes, following information received from the director of the SSA, as well as the head of the special branch, he applied for emergency leave 5 days to travel outside of the jurisdiction. This was approved by the minister and done with full knowledge of the Service Commission. The DCP of Administration, Junior Benjamin, was appointed accounting officer because, again, the courts, when it came time to have Gary Griffith act as commissioner, one of those situations, a court came down and basically said an acting commissioner must still, I believe this is what it was, an acting commissioner must still be approved by Parliament, right? I could be wrong about that, but I believe that's when that ruling happened. And this is just before the Keith Rowley administration had a falling out with Gary Griffith when they were seemingly trying to put things in place for him to continue as acting as Commissioner of Police. So I believe by making DCP Benjamin accounting officer, he still can exercise financial controls in order to ensure that nothing grinds to a halt while the commissioner is away. So what's interesting is that I do find it still weird that the Commissioner of Police is the one that's going to go based off of information from the SSA and Special Branch. This is because on some level he is not necessarily an intelligence head, and the TTPS is not the body of Trinidad and Tobago's that would engage in international cooperation outside of its borders. Traditionally, police services, you might send police officers to go observe other police services, right? In certain cases, in certain special cases, you might send technical experts. I believe Scotland Yard sent tactical officers to various Commonwealth member states in order to achieve certain things, to assist in local law enforcement. But a police service is usually restricted to operating within the confines of its own country. So I'm very curious, probably will never know the answer. What is it that could have compelled the commissioner to go, as opposed to, given the fact that it's outside of our borders, an agency which is more appropriate for foreign liaison work, or someone in charge of one of the arms of national security that is more appropriate to go abroad in order to do whatever intelligence gathering, consultation mission. It's a very odd thing. There's no scenario that comes to mind. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? But I find it interesting, right? Technically, the commissioner has refused to reveal the actual reason, only that basically based on intelligence he left. And again, he has no authority technically to act outside of our jurisdiction. He has very little functions to carry out outside of our jurisdiction. So while I am more willing to assume that there's nothing wrong here, I still have my doubts. It's not as though we hear commissioners of police going abroad all the time on an emergency basis. And again, is he going to assist somebody? Why send him? Why not send maybe a technical expert in whatever relevant field of assistance, right? The only thing is, if this has something to do with his previous position or positions, where I am under the impression, as far as I know, he was essentially an intelligence officer within the police service, right? But again, he's the commissioner. I guess ultimately speaking, the question I'm raising is, was it appropriate for the commissioner of police to go? Because we need to understand something. We don't know what he was getting himself into, who he was contacting, what risks he may or may not have been taking. And we're in a state of emergency. So how pressing was it? And therein lies the issue with national security considerations. They will always need to have room for secrecy, and that secrecy directly contravenes accountability. And I believe what the commissioner might not be fully appreciating, right? Because he said, responding to those who had politicized the issue, he remarked, "Your petticoat is showing." So all I'll say is this: if you were a true professional, you wouldn't have even said that. Because the problem is, I want to give you the benefit of the doubt, and the reason why you need the benefit of the doubt is the very same reason that you said why you're not going to say anything more. You are not at liberty to discuss it. We have to take you at your word. That is technically a tall ask. We are not your subordinates. We are not the minister's subordinates. We are not the chief of the defense forces subordinates. We technically don't have to take you at your word. We technically don't have to believe you. And given the fact that by your own doing, you have undermined trust and confidence in yourself, your institution, and the people at the executive level to some extent, one could say that you have a lot of gall to call out the petticoat of others who politicize the issue when you yourself might not necessarily be in the best of standing with the general public. And their willingness to give you the benefit of the doubt, not being there, their willingness to show their petticoat, one could argue the fault of that lies with you, because you made people, or you're making people think that you have taken a political position. Because we're not seeing necessarily great leadership or great policy decisions. And again, the government and the commissioner needed to understand they came into a disadvantaged situation that they didn't cause, but they have to deal with. That's the price of taking up the job, given how it has been left, the state it was left that you found it in. You don't get to say, I am resetting public perception of the office of the commissioner. The office of the commissioner and the police executive started to be perceived to be more and more connected to the politics or aligned with politicians. That, while based somewhat in speculation, is one of the few things for the public to try to reason out the ridiculous decisions we've seen from top levels of the police service in the last few years of the PNM's previous administration. The Brent Thomas affair. If you successfully conducted an investigation into that and had an alternative explanation, that's fine, but you didn't. It looks political. Unless you want to say that a commissioner of police went off half-cocked and sent officers on her own to kidnap a citizen of ours from a foreign jurisdiction. What about the arrest of a sitting commissioner earlier with Christopher? We have no explanation for that. And the police executive that more or less existed, at least to some extent, for both of those situations, they're still there. Was it all Erla? Well, how did she order her subordinate to arrest herself? And this is what you walked into. You walked into a situation where you had a former prime minister, while in office, interfering with the process of handing off the merit list, the process of compiling the merit list, allegedly, and therefore interrupting or interfering with the process of selecting your predecessor's predecessor or your substantive predecessor. And that interference caused the former Police Service Commission to collapse, and it had to be reformed. All of these things imply political interference into the police service, and it doesn't matter that it's a new government. It does not, particularly again when some, if not all, of the remainder of the executive were there when some of these things happened. But more importantly, the wariness of the public doesn't just go away because you get new politicians. Because on some level, all politicians subconsciously at this point are viewed as corrupt. So you're not going to assume, well, this batch is going to just magically be better than the other batch. No, you're going to be wary. You're going to want to wait and see. Meanwhile, you and the Minister of Homeland Security apparently are joined at the hip. But what made it worse is that you apparently are joined at the hip over the issue of body cameras, which is an implication of a desire to not have them. How the situation has been handled implies, I don't want to say blatant, but it's difficult to look beyond the implication that there's no urgency. And this is after you had a shooting that the public had high levels of suspicions over, which you mishandled the explanation of and the treatment of, and then you are doubling down on essentially showing your hand of having no sense of agency when it comes to procuring body cameras. So forgive me, but your petticoat was already shown. Your inability, your weaknesses have already been shown. And because of that, I can't look at you and say, here is a great commissioner, and I will put my faith in him once again. No, I look at you and say, here is a commissioner that I have a lot of questions over, and I should give him the benefit of the doubt for situations like this, because these type of situations can happen in national security. Again, it's very interesting that it's happening with the commissioner. But it can happen in national security in general, so we should afford him some degree of benefit of the doubt. We should have some reasonable understanding. But you have successfully battered, if not shattered, your credibility when it comes to public communications, at least with some. And here's my problem. If you want to have the argument, well, he's the commissioner of police, and how can he mistrust the commissioner of police? The country will fall apart. You have to trust the commissioner of police. Here's my problem with that line of thinking, that assumption that we have to support the commissioner of police. We have to, right? Here's my problem. I will bet you money that anyone that wants to say that on principle we have to support this commissioner of police was ready to throw any and everything they could at a former commissioner of police earlier with Christopher. They question the PNM's government supporting their commissioner. I will bet money that anyone that says we must support the current commissioner of police were more than willing to not support the previous commissioner of police, because she was seen, viewed as politically on the other side. Meanwhile, I am applying the same standard. I am applying the same level of judgment. You do things that I find questionable, I will question you. Right? Now, this is not the end of the world. This is not that big of a deal. I have more issue with his statement about people politicizing the issue, saying that their petticoat is showing, because to me, it is practically a pot calling kettle black at this point. I have more issue with that and his lack of awareness of the public perception that he has allowed himself to generate about himself than the actual issue at hand. Because the actual issue at hand, we don't know, which one could argue is rather convenient for the commissioner. We don't know what it is, right? But I'm willing to give a little bit of benefit of the doubt in the sense that I am not going to speculate out of hand about random things, not without some sort of reasoning or logical argument, some kind of clue that could maybe point me to a reasonable direction. Otherwise, I'm just shooting in the dark with something like this. And I'd rather not shoot in the dark. That's not useful to just come up with something out of thin air, right? Maybe someone might know these things better and have a more reasonable background or line of thinking to then speculate on something that might have a little bit more basis in historical information or procedure or the like or whatever. But I, on the other hand, this is one of the areas, or this is one time where I'm saying, I don't know enough on what it could be. Again, in part, the fact that it's the commissioner going off on a foreign sojourn is what's throwing me here. So I'm willing to leave it alone. Please note my discomfort while doing so. But you want to complain about people politicizing the issue while acting defensive like a run-of-the-mill politician, while throwing barbs and joining in on the bacchanal like a run-of-the-mill politician. So as I said before, and I know that this is something that is probably lost on you, and I guess my expectations should be lowered given the fact that you were promoted by jumping ranks and you lack any significant executive experience. So in that regard, you're not that dissimilar to the Minister of Homeland Security. So we need to give Baby a pass, because how can Baby know everything that they need to know? At least to some extent. The problem is you are actually sitting in the chair and you do actually have to do the job, and we are actually dependent on you doing the job. And that's one of the issues. We don't know what you were doing. We don't know if you were doing your job. No offense, the Minister of Homeland Security approving your leave is not the reassurance, I think, for a lot of the citizens of the country who are not diehard UNC supporters. It's just not. Because again, his political capital has also been ruined by similar words, deeds, actions, or inaction. Right alongside with you, right at the hip. Let me not say that. Let me not say what I was going to say. So, you want to act like a politician? Don't be vexed when people start to view you as political. That's how you're making it come across. You're playing politics potentially with regards to how you manage the police service, which on some level, I understand that no police commissioner could technically fully escape from that, right? You can't. I understand that, but still, try to at least appear you have some consideration for the public on certain issues now. But then more importantly, you and the minister being in lockstep, that's a great way to show the independence of the police service. Right? When the minister, you and the minister being in lockstep. When the minister said no minister could call for a PDO. And then when we see what limited things we have seen for the Scabga Hadid arrest, And more and more I believe that the leak was done by someone looking to get support for the government and to try to kill the support for the Hadids and Star Sabga, because of course she said very unpleasant things in that recording. But the reality is, given the narrative that they were trying to sell us, that the government was trying to sell us, that law enforcement was trying to sell us, the Minister of Homeland Security was trying to sell us, I believe it backfired spectacularly. Because up to now, there is no indication that Dominic Hadid was involved in anything. And yet it seemed as though he was the central figure for a while. And he had an issue with the government. He had a pre-action protocol letter that was already sent. Nobody thought to think this might not look good optically. If we're going on a fishing expedition, we need to cross our T's and dot I's. Nobody thought to do that. And what makes it better is the fact that the minister decided to release, not place under house arrest, but just release the Hadids, heavily implies that no T's were crossed, no I's were dotted, and this is potentially an example of sloppy police work at best and political persecution at worst. And the minister eventually had to push the brakes on the more excessive aspects of that. Meanwhile, Star Sabga, her representatives are stating that, so there's been a couple of stories about this. One was a headline that she lost 29 pounds, has difficulty sleeping, and has chest pains, and has not been properly examined by a doctor. At one point, she was examined by her doctor. Well, she was visited by her doctor. I'm not sure if she was examined. And I find this inconsistency to be very weird. You arrest 3 people for conspiracy to murder the Prime Minister, which was a curveball after you said you're going after corruption. So people were already like, I thought it was corruption. Why conspiracy to murder the Prime Minister? 2 middle-aged people and an old woman? My issue was, unless you're telling me that one of them was the triggerman, one of them was the driver, one of them was the planner, they need to have other people. As was pointed out by people on this show, to prove conspiracy, you might need certain things. Just talking is not a conspiracy, particularly when you hear the context of the leak. I don't know if this was amateur hour policing, detective work, where someone thought that that leak proved conspiracy to murder without a reasonable doubt. I think it's safe to say from a layman's perspective that nothing could be further from the truth. If anything, that leaked audio proved that the niece was trying to calm down her aunt, who was ranting like a normal person. We know this because there were dozens, if not hundreds, of comments saying that this is something that they themselves have done, will do, or they know people who do it. The commenters, that is. So, how is it we have a situation where the only able-bodied man somehow is allowed to be released all of a sudden? Remember, the argument was they have the means. They have the means. They have the means, and their aunt said mean things about the Prime Minister. So, it's a threat. It's such a threat that he has the means. They released him. And yet, the aunt is still being detained under house arrest. But her ability to utilize any sort of services, particularly medical, seemingly is restricted. Now, there was a situation where they wanted a whole set of lawyers to visit her. The commissioner said no. I could understand that. I really don't understand what is the point of removing someone from a prison, putting them on a house arrest, and then apparently there are limitations to when their doctor could see them. We're not talking about a whole medical team of 57 doctors and nurses, and who knows who could be smuggled in with that. As far as I'm aware, we're talking about one doctor, 70-year-old woman. Does anyone consider the fact that if this is a serious medical condition, we have had people go to hospital, doctors downplay the symptoms or assume that it's benign, send them home, and they have unfortunately passed away. Those things have happened throughout human history. Someone with responsibility over this situation is willing to roll that dice and there's nothing there? You're making to make that assumption in your expert opinion? Because heaven help us if this poor lady, anything happens to her medically that's serious beyond whatever might have already happened to her. Heaven help us. Not that I think there'll be any sort of hellfire and brimstone from a certain demographic, but rather, what does that say about us? Society is judged by how you treat the most vulnerable. I would argue an elderly lady, regardless of whatever means she has, her family has, or her friends and community has, is technically one of the vulnerable. Because similar to the protesters over the Kayasili charges and arrest, similar to Mr. Samaru, Senior, Christopher Samaru, this just looks like political vindictiveness, given the fact that you don't want to explain yourself fully, given the fact that you want to sit on your high horse and say, we don't need to explain ourselves, blah, 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 blah. That's fine. But be careful you don't play yourself and end up wrecking yourself. You're setting up the narrative or lack thereof. You're giving us the limited information. Then you don't like what the public does with it, which is things that I said about the PNM in the past. Don't leave the public to their own devices and then be upset when their speculation is negative towards you. The PNM ain't in power. They have nothing to do with this. There's only you. You're the only target of public speculation, scrutiny, and suspicion. You're the only one. If you don't understand what that means, the difficulties and the challenges of this life that you have chosen for yourself with both eyes open, well then I'm sorry. You're not cut out for that work. The court of public opinion is not fair. Stop complaining about how unfair it is. Not even the PNM acted this foolishly at times. I have to admit, the Auditor General thing, that is still some special kind of nonsense, to be fair. But now there's a situation where now we have, just by the way, we are coming up to the end of the state of emergency. And while we have had situations like this before, remember under the Keith Rowley administration, there were threats against schools at least one time, right? But isn't it interesting that ever since this government was elected, we have had threats against the government, we have had threats against public officials, we have had threats against law enforcement, we have had threats against the Prime Minister, now we have threats against various public places, including state-owned locations, like the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government in Maraval, the Judicial Building in Bacalet, Tobago, the Magistrates Courts in San Grande, Arima, in San Grande, Arima, Shogunas, Couva, Princestown, San Fernando, Superior, and Point Fortin. And the one non-government location, Valpark Shopping Plaza. Every few months there's a new threat. Now here's the problem. I remember the police said this is probably someone who's up to mischief, right? And this is the most plausible explanation. Given the threatened locations, the targeted locations, right? The areas where they are for the most part, this might be someone up to mischief. Or This could be someone testing certain responses in order to fish for information. How do you respond to these threats? How do you respond to this threat to the shopping plaza? How do you respond to this ministry in Maraval? How do you respond to any threats to these magistrate courts? There's also going to be a situation where you keep threatening things and they become red herrings. Eventually someone's going to be complacent and expose a vulnerability that should not exist, but complacency causes it to exist. But then there's the fourth explanation. If I would expect that if this government said that there is another conspiracy to kill the Prime Minister, the public's collective groan might be audible in space. Because I have never seen a state of emergency where crime is down, but not only does the government have to put new crime measures in place in order to increase public safety, while crime is down, by the way. State of emergency is working. It's working so much, we still need to be concerned about public safety in certain areas, right? Now, I'm not saying that the latter is false. I'm saying if the latter is true, concerns about public safety, then the former is also true. Crime is down and the SOE is working. Technically, if you knew what you was doing, you'd be able to explain that. But, you know, no one ever accused politicians of being good at their job. So, the state of emergency is coming up to a close. It's coming to an end. And here's the thing. Just this Monday, there were reports over the weekend, I believe, and from Friday, and so on and so on. More PDOs were being issued against gang leaders and different people, more and more PDOs. The state of emergency is technically going to end in a month. Now, unless this is a case where we just need them off the street for a month in order to prevent something or the other, fine. But given the fact that our national security apparatus seemingly just chucks people into detention and doesn't really know what to do with them after that, they just want them held, I can't reasonably assume that this is really just for the last month, they just need these people off the streets. So the implication, therefore, is that they expect to be able to hold them past September. Because the state of emergency is working, and yet how is it that the threats against the government, which is basically assassination or terrorism, how is it that these sorts of things are growing? You want to make us feel safer, and yet basically say every few months, there's a threat against MPs, there's a threat against government buildings, there's a threat against members of the judiciary, there's a threat against the Prime Minister. There was a threat against MPs. They didn't change their schedule, they didn't evacuate the public from the public viewing gallery, they continued on meeting with a foreign minister. While there is a threat against MPs, they didn't inform Red House staff. As far as I'm aware, they didn't inform the security apparatus around the Red House, nor did they give the opposition MPs any courtesy of informing them. But there was a threat against MPs. One random Friday, because some random Yahoo in Belmont apparently probably had a rant, and a rant is enough to have these cowards tuck their tail between their legs, push the panic button, and do Lord knows what in order to safeguard their own skins, because somehow they seemingly think these sorts of things are credible. If they think it's credible, because that's what they're telling us, right? They're saying, according to them, these are credible threats. If these threats are credible, maybe we need to ask ourselves, why to them are these threats credible? Why? Do they have a guilty conscience? Do they think that there might be some reason for someone to hate them so much to want to do them harm? But not just do them harm, but risk going against the state in order to carry out such a crime, making it extremely more heinous. And yet that does not dissuade them because, again, according to the government, these are credible threats. So we're not just talking about someone disliking someone to the point where they want to cause them harm. No, we're talking about someone willing to go against the state if necessary, willing to go against the entire nation. That's the level of contempt they have. According to the government's logic, apparently, they view this as plausible. I'm not saying that this is what they actually believe, but what I'm saying is their narrative implies that they view a plausible occurrence of individuals who have reason enough to hate them to attempt to do something like this. That's the narrative that they're selling us. So the question is, to what extent do we want to believe it? Because the implication is they're telling us, yes, we did do something to cause people to hate us that badly. What could it be? It doesn't help that the last time Prime Minister Kamala Persad-Bissessar was Prime Minister, we also had a state of emergency with threats against the government. This needs, in terms of a national record, this easily is the government or the politician that has had most threats against itself or herself. Why? And here's the thing. Under the partnership, when she fired the first minister, I said, all right, showing people can't get away with nonsense. When she fired a few more, I'm like, all right, making sure they understand, holding everybody to account. And as I mentioned before, once she started getting to the double-digit range of firing ministers, then you have diminishing returns. Then the question is not about whether you're holding ministers to account or not. It's about why is it that so many of them need to be fired? In theory, you're selecting them. How could you select so many of the wrong type of people? And the reason why I could say they're the wrong type of people is that they're the type that apparently are not up to your standards and you are subsequently forced to fire them. That type of people. Nothing to do with anything else, just to do with their ability to do the job. Apparently it's the wrong ability that they had. And now you're like, well, how does she select her ministers if you have to fire so many of them? Now we get to the state of emergency situation, and it's the same thing, diminishing returns. How are we supposed to feel safer if every few months there's a new grand conspiracy of terrorism or threat of assassination of public officials? We are supposed to then feel safer in this environment that you are technically trying to convince us of to justify the state of emergency. There was only one instance when a plot to kill some government official was not included, and that was, I believe, the first renewal. The first renewal, they basically said crime is high, we keep it in the state of emergency. All right, fine. And then the next one was, well, crime is high and there are threats against government. And we've continued going along that path ever since. Only under this government can you have a state of emergency and the most serious crime or allegations of the most serious crime will increase. Murders are down, but threats to murder government officials are up. What's going wrong? Let's take, if we can, the comment now. Good day, governments, I believe it's supposed to be governments plural, not governments possessive. Governments might do wrong, and though as an individual I can do little about it, I will still call out the wrongdoing. I will not simply put it down to reality, and it is what it is. Thank you for that. Because it is what it is, that is essentially complacency that allows a lot of nonsense to happen, right? The PRM should have never been allowed to descend to the depths that they descended. And yes, we rectify the situation by voting them out of office, but the problem is, for certain situations, the damage is already done. The damage to the perception of the police service and its independence and the process of selecting a commissioner is already done. And we didn't even see, technically, consequence outside of an election defeat with regards to that nonsense. So we can't always restore things after the fact. We have to try to prevent the damage. Otherwise, we will still bear negative consequences down the line. Therefore, I will call out the heinous act of genocide committed against the Palestinians. It therefore pains me to see my government collaborate with a genocidal regime because doing so suits my government's interests. Well, we'll continue this part of the conversation in a bit. We will. But I'd just like to quickly mention one thing, and I'll probably pick this up on the interest of time tomorrow. But have you seen what's come out of the Communication Workers Union? Oh my, it's juicy. And this is now where, just shifting topics to close up the segment, this is now where you could say the government now, the connection that national security has to the government is also being hit with negative perceptions due to what baggage the government has. Because the head of the CWU is refuting the claims by Minister Padrath that there was no 10% wage offer on the table for TSCT workers. And the long and short is, Ojir is basically saying that they asked her, which is, I believe, the leadership team that was negotiating with TSCT, right? In fact, they and the minister. So this is what she said. You all asked the Communications Workers Union to give you all 3 months. Give us 3 months. Your words were, please take down the heat. You know what we said? We will take down the heat. What you want the 3 months for? To get the books in order. We said, all right, but remember we have negotiations. You, Roshan Babwa, and Kino Cox said, no problem. Now, Padrath is saying there was no agreement for 10% or no 10% offer. And that is contrary to what the head of the CW is saying. She's rejecting suggestions that TSCT workers were being unreasonable or greedy and expressed concern about the state of the company. Kino Cox, he's gone. He left. And she's saying, maybe, Minister, you need to look at this Mr. Boabwa fellow. Who's advising you these things? Because you're saying what the minister and TSC and Mr. Babwa apparently, that side of the equation is basically claiming that what the CWU's head is stating did not happen. And she is saying that's not true. It did. And here's the thing. I am left to wonder, 10%. Did they actually think that they would have been able to offer 10% across the board? Hence why the question, where's the money? Where's Mr. Elder in all of this, just by the way? In fact, he's a junior minister in the Ministry of Public Utilities. Is it because there might be a perceived conflict of interest that he stayed away? Then why put him in that ministry in the first place? Is it similar to Leroy Batiste? I don't understand. Doesn't that then compromise their ability to do their job because their job requires them to take up certain responsibilities? Just saying. But more importantly, it seems as though the minister cannot placate the CWU. They did take down the heat, and now they're here to turn it back up again. And what does that say about labor and labor negotiations and the relationship with the government? It says like with national security and other things, there are inconsistencies. And I loathe inconsistencies. Because usually, such things are a sign of inequality and unfairness and potentially imply other questionable circumstances. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll welcome our guests. Stay tuned. This is Talking About WSN. We'll continue the conversation that the comments started. We'll be right back after this.
In this day of stay-at-home and work from home, home has never meant more than it does today. Whether you're looking to buy, rent, or build your new home, now is the time to get going. Gittins & Gittins real estate agents are here to take you to that place of your dreams. Let us take you home. We help you find that rental to rest along the way or journey with you to find your home destination. Investors and commercial enterprises too, call us and we'll walk the distance to place your business in just the right location. Owners, leave the headaches to us. We'll find your tenants or buyers while you stay at home. We'll even manage your property at your bidding. Anything real estate, come home to Gittins & Gittins Real Estate. Call us at 760-3280 or 747-1220 or visit us at 16 Fifth Street in Woodbrook.
Knowing how to tell authentic is as easy as 1, 2, 3. Find it, match it, search it. Step 1. Find the style number on the tag. Step 2. Match the style number inside the jersey with the number on the tag. Step 3. Search it. A quick Google search of the style number will verify the jersey is authentic when the search results match the jersey being searched. Don't be fooled by counterfeit jerseys. Before you buy, remember to find it, match it, search it.
Fan Zone, 2 locations nationwide. Center City Mall, Chaguanas and Movietown, Port of Spain. Nationwide delivery available.
Welcome back to Talking Point. Sean Michael Small here. And the conversations with regards to international politics is always interesting. Usually, it does not affect us. But interestingly enough, this is a situation where it's not about world economics, it's not about the Caribbean region or the Western Hemisphere, but it still technically is affecting us because whether by national security agreements, agreements with regards to commercial contracts in the military-industrial complex, or international diplomacy and political support for various groups or stakeholders, we have been whether directly or indirectly, connected to the State of Israel, and therefore have some kind of hand or connection to what's going on in the Levant. That is the area right there at the east of the Mediterranean where essentially Judeo-Christian religions have their holy lands. And more or less, because of that convergence, I would argue, there have been at least, well, one could say centuries of hostility, which has now turned into what seems, I would term as, never-ending animosity. And in order to give us a competing perspective as compared to some of our other commenters and callers from yesterday and before, we have with us, joining us today via Zoom, he is the Executive Director of the Understanding Israel Foundation, Mr. Nicholas Jagdeo. Welcome to Talking Point, sir. Happy to have you.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
So, first of all, I believe you were telling me yesterday with regards to your background, you have studied the situation not just as an armchair historian. This, to some extent, is part of your actual academic learning. So why don't you just explain to us your background with regards to your knowledge base on your region, and then we could get into the foundation.
Sure, Sean. So I have my MA in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. That was really inspired by Mr. Hans Stetcher, who was a Jewish refugee to Trinidad and Tobago. He established the Stetcher's Fine Gift Stores throughout the Caribbean, and Hans was a very dear friend of mine, and his story really was something phenomenal and something that needed to be preserved, and the memory of what he went through was something I needed to study in detail. So I enrolled in the master's program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva University, and so I think I'm quite qualified to talk about genocide and what that entails with the current situation between Israel and Hamas.
Right, and you formed an organization, the Understanding Israel Foundation. I guess this is one of those things where we are essentially half a world away from seemingly everywhere that isn't, you know, South America. So a lot of times people, they might have personal interests, but at times, whether it was pre the internet where there wasn't a lot of news, or post social media when now there is so much news, it's difficult to separate truth from fiction, who is embellishing and who is accurate. I do find that people generally go off more on emotion rather than factual arguments. There's still some basis of fact. Was the foundation, in a way, an attempt to have a local body in order to lend their voice to that whole debate of what is truth and what is fiction?
In a way, yes, to an extent. We launched in June 2023, so 4 months before the heinous Hamas attacks on Israel, which precipitated all of these events that we're seeing now. So we were also caught very unaware, like everybody around the world, when Hamas launched its attack. Our intention was to deepen the ties between Trinidad and Tobago and Israel. I launched this organization from a very personal place. I lived in Israel for a long time. And coming back to Trinidad, I started to wonder, well, why are some of the problems existing here that could be easily corrected with Israeli ingenuity? Despite what anyone may think about Israel, it is known as the startup nation. It is a powerhouse of innovation, of ingenuity. So Understanding Israel Foundation was formed to help transform Trinidad and Tobago, to help link the Trinidadian community, the Trinidadian society, the Trinidadian ills to a possible solution. What we're seeing here now, post October 7th, is that we had to stand to defeat some of those misconceptions and some of those outright lies that are being parroted. You know, Sean, repeat a lie over and over and over, people start to think it's truth. For instance, the term genocide. As a genocide and Holocaust scholar, it alarms me that this word is being used with such nonchalance when everything is genocide, nothing is genocide. And it's very alarming that, to use the term you just quoted there, armchair historians are sitting there and labeling this a genocide when the facts don't line up there. So just to go back to the mission of Understanding Israel Foundation, it is to bridge Trinidad and Tobago and Israel. And if you permit me, I just want to share a bit of the history between the state of Israel and Trinidad and Tobago. In June 1962, the premier of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Eric Williams, traveled to Israel to ask for their support for our independence quest at the United Nations, which Israel freely gave. And on August 30th, and for all Trinidadians who went to high school, we know that August 30th is not the day of our independence, but on August 30th, 1962, Trinidad and Tobago received a Jerusalem Bible from Prime Minister Ben-Gurion in Israel, welcoming us into the family of nations. This effectively makes Israel the first country in the world to recognize Trinidad and Tobago as an independent nation. And on August 31st, 1962, Trinidad and Tobago immediately entered into diplomatic relations with 6 countries, the usual suspects, the UK, the US, but also Israel. And so embedded in the very fabric of our beginnings is Israel. And of course, everybody knows about the Star of David, which is so very proudly displayed with a hummingbird on the insignia of our police. And I also just want to quickly share that Trinidad and Tobago was one of 4 countries in the world which proudly and very welcomingly allowed Jews escaping Nazi persecution in World War II to enter and find safe haven here. So around roughly 1,000 to 1,200 Jewish souls managed to escape the brutality and the gas chambers and the murders that were happening in Europe and found life here. And out of that, now nearly 5,000 people around the world are alive with a connection to Trinidad and Tobago.
Now, there's a part of me that regrets the use of the term armchair historians, except I did kind of use it in order to make a point. There is a difference between someone like you who studied certain aspects of this and someone even like me, right? In terms of being a historian, I too am an armchair historian, right? Some journalists might maybe have studied history, and others have to settle for being an armchair historian. I'm technically not a journalist. I would just call myself a commenter. Just by the way, I do not ascribe to reach the heights of that professional responsibility, right? But with that said, similar to the use of the word genocide, I found myself multiple times since, well, for years now, I had a similar issue with the use of the word terrorism, right? In regards to this, the general public started to see a situation where, oh my gosh, people were killed and it engendered fear, it's terrorism. Because, you know, fear, it caused fear, so it's terrorism. And I was left beside myself saying, no, just because there's a mass homicide, because some crazy Yahoo decides to shoot up a bunch of people, that in and of itself doesn't make it terrorism. A school shooting is technically not necessarily terrorism. It's a mass casualty event. It's a heinous crime. It requires a certain extreme level of law enforcement response, but it's not terrorism. Terrorism is utilizing violence for political means or to achieve a political objective, and that requires a specific response. And I think it's similar to what you're saying. If every mass casualty event is labeled as terrorism, then we will actually lose sight on what was the point of having this specific label for a specific type of crime or a specific type of act to allow for a specific response. And then we just dilute the whole thing, and it all of a sudden becomes meaningless. Because not every mass murderer has a message. Some people are just evil. It is what it is. This was the situation that most comes to mind is a mass shooting in Las Vegas, where there was some crazy Yahoo with a lot of guns in a hotel apartment just shooting people at the street. Or when you had the DC sniper, right? 2 guys in the back of a car just killing random people. There was no political point to that. So you're not going to have an anti-terrorism unit. You're probably going to want maybe a serial killer unit, a profiling unit, a homicide unit, not necessarily a terrorism unit. So with that said, I understand people get emotional and they want to apply the most heinous labels to what they see as a heinous act. But for the sake of accuracy, what would you say is the technical definition of genocide? Let's try to unpack this.
Right. Very simply, genocide is the intent to erase an entire people, an ethnic people, a religious group, a tribe, any sort of identifying commonality of a people. That's what genocide is, the intent to destroy them. It doesn't always lead to the actual destruction of the people, but it's the intent. What is the intent behind it? Just to go along what you were saying with terrorism there, it is applicable, because what is the intent of the mass shooter? Is it a young guy who was, bullied in high school and wants to make a political statement and go out in a blaze of glory? That, of course, is, as you said, not terrorism. It's a mass shooting and needs to be treated as such. So genocide is something very specific and anchored in international law as an intent to do something. Sometimes, unfortunately, the intent achieves its objective.
And, well, I mean, there's a whole other thing with regards to international law, because I feel, am I correct based on your knowledge and experience? People want to view international law like how they view the laws of their nation. And I'm like, time out. There's no legislative body and no international. Interpol is not an international police agency. It is basically a information sharing liaison office, right? There is no high authority to enforce international law. It's treaty. So it's a tricky situation now where, oh my gosh, it's against international law. International law is not something passed by a legislative body. It's whatever the negotiations wanted to be at the time that it was signed on. And it's not quite the same. And it's similar to the use of genocide and terrorism, where people have this kind of emotional attachment to what they think it is when it technically is not that. And then the responses of nations in various situations when it comes to international diplomacy, they kind of take it for granted or oversimplify it and maybe view it idealistically, and it's not always the most effective way of viewing things. Would you say that's correct?
I think you're entirely right. International law doesn't have the policing behind it to be enforced, and of course international law is also, it's an evolving thing. The specificity of genocide itself and the lens of the world on it started after World War II. And the term itself grew out of the Holocaust. So it is a developing field within a developing area within international law. But what we have so far, as you said, it is something that is based on norms and treaties, as you said, and it really is something that we have to be very careful about how we approach as countries.
Now, I think part of the problem is, first of all, do you have any reason to dispute some of the claims with regards to the casualty numbers coming from Gaza?
Yes, I'll give you an excellent example, Sean. In 2021, as is the norm with Hamas, they started sending rockets into Israel. This was around March or April, I think, 2021. And I saw the comments on Facebook and social media immediately parroting what Hamas was putting out. Immediately, it was 20,000 dead. And I tried to caution people. I said, you're parroting what a terrorist organization is claiming. Would you wait and listen and see? And people didn't. People are in the moment. They see the headlines, and that's what they go with. They base their opinions on these things. So a lot of people came out of that skirmish between Hamas and Israel in 2021 with the idea that Israel had willy-nilly killed 20,000 Gazan Palestinians. By November 2021, when the actual figures were released, Sean, it was 465 Palestinians, Gazan Palestinians, who had died from Israeli responses to Hamas rocket attacks. And of that 465, 25% had died from failed Hamas rocket launches falling back into Gaza. So What we're seeing here is everyone taking Hamas figures and running with it. That started at the very beginning of the war. I remember by October 9th, 2 days after October 7th, Israel was still trying to calculate the actual figures of those who had been massacred in southern Israel. That number continued to be figured out for months. Whereas when you see anything happen in Gaza, Hamas is immediately putting out, oh, 100 people dead, 50 people dead. How are they able to ascertain such numbers in real time? This is the thing that doesn't make sense to me, and probably the way the media just tends to pick up on what Hamas says and run with that as factual figures. News media sources, the UN, all of this is quoting what Hamas says. We're now 3 years later. Let's look at what the numbers are saying. Even Hamas is admitting that what Israel was saying all along, those numbers are verified, are true, are correct. But we also have to take into context that the numbers being released by Hamas, around 70,000 to 73,000, every single one of them are all deaths in Gaza. So an old man who dies of a heart attack, dies in his sleep, those numbers were absorbed into Hamas casualty figures. And so it's just a situation, Sean, where we need to sometimes take a step back and wait before forming opinions. People tend to run with immediately what they see, and of course you're trusting news sources, but are you following up with the news sources afterwards when they're putting out the little blurb, we apologize? Because the news sources tend to do that very often. They run with something in a headline, and then 2 days later they're apologizing for it. Nobody sees that. Just like that story I told you about in 2021. 20,000 dead. Everyone walked away from that. Nobody looked at November 2021 when Hamas agreed that it was 465 Gazans who had died in that skirmish.
We saw a similar thing with regards to COVID deaths, because then locally there were questions of, well, was it COVID or was it just other natural causes? Cancer continued. People get heart attacks before COVID. It doesn't have to be COVID. People have diabetes, complications, regardless of COVID. So, because I think what people will assume is he had a heart attack because they were bombing him. It's like, well, technically speaking, a population of however many million will still have heart attacks regardless of the bombings or the not. So now, of course, the question is, how do you attribute what? Because I would argue that there might be some cases where medical conditions were legitimately exasperated by what was going on. And for civilians like myself, we would want to include it. But now you get into a very subjective game, and we saw this with COVID, and there's no real great answer to this because there will always be gray area with regards to that. That said, I believe, am I correct that the IDF is basically stating it's around 22,000 that they have killed?
Of the total amount who have killed, 22,000 are confirmed Hamas terrorists. As of right now. That's what the idea is.
So how many more is the figure? Do they know?
Well, Israeli estimates are around 70,000. I think Hamas agrees with that figure. The number of Palestinian civilians versus Hamas terrorists is the lowest in the history of urban warfare. Even going by this, current figures of 22,000 Hamas terrorists being confirmed by Israel and the IDF as being eliminated versus 73,000 in total. So that's about 1/3 of the mark has been achieved. Now, of course, every civilian death is an enormous, it's very sorrowful that that happens. But in the history of urban warfare, such a low ratio has not happened before. It really is a study into effective military responses when you look at it. Now, at the same time, Sean, and I just want to caution, those numbers may go up. Hamas has repeatedly lied. It has repeatedly lied about who has died. And I see a lot of things, oh, women, children, and for every woman and child, legitimate woman and child, non-combatant who has died, it is obviously a tragedy, and for every man as well. Of course, we're not going to exclude the men who have died and who are not involved in this, the civilians. But at the same time, the numbers are climbing because Hamas tends to fabricate and doctor numbers, figures, ages, names. So it's being uncovered right now. Even Hamas is admitting that some of these kids are not kids. It's actual adults who, and of course now that leads into another question. What constitutes an adult? A lot of the children in Gaza are radicalized, sadly, very, very sadly, and used as human shields by Hamas, which does not have any care about their civilian lives at all whatsoever. So kids are being put with guns and sent out into the streets, and kids are being strapped with well, currently right now not, thankfully, but we're being strapped with suicide bombs to go after the IDF. It is a terrible situation there, Sean, and this is why I caution us to sit back, wait. I know that it may seem that we need to form an opinion in this moment, but we don't have all the information in front of us yet. Even Israel is still compiling information and releasing that.
To be fair, before this week, so I believe it was sometime last week, I saw a video of a father egging on his child to throw a rock at what appeared to be IDF soldiers. And the reason why I believe the translation was correct was because the child did pick up a rock and threw it in the general direction. He missed, right? It was more like the child looked as though he was kind of still playing, whereas the adults were all like, all right, what's going on? Because it was a very surreal situation. It was a very young child. We're talking like 4 years old, 3 years old, maybe 5, maybe 6, but very small child where like they're not even fully understanding the instructions and they're just kind of like, you know, moping around. Now, with regards to military action, I'll say this. People might not necessarily appreciate this. But one of the interesting things is we have 2 wars in parallel going on. And one of the things that we need to understand is at times the hostility between Israel and Hamas actually was a precursor to some of the scenarios we see in Ukraine where you see artillery and airstrikes and the like. You don't always see troops on the ground. You don't always see it. And Israel has been one of the leading manufacturers and innovators on defensive technologies and intercept technologies. They have the Iron Dome. They are apparently developing the Iron Beam. And even then, there are limitations to these systems. And both America's actions in Iran and the war in Ukraine have shown that defensive systems do have some limitations, right? There are ways to bypass it. And people on some level need to understand, it's not the fact that Israel is counterattacking that's the issue, or preemptively trying to go after the offensive systems and fighters of Hamas because they don't want to always have to just rely on passive defense. They want to have an active engagement in order to eliminate the threat. So I think people need to understand, I'm not disagreeing with that. And to me, that's reasonable. But I guess what happens is once people start to see the numbers, right? Because I do believe America's global war on terror, their casualty figures, I can't speak to the Iraqis or the Afghanistans, and part of the problem is it's not as though the Americans did all the killings of Iraqis and Afghanistans. You had individual factions fighting there. But the global war on terror did not have this level of casualties. Modern society views very small numbers of casualties, relatively speaking, to military action as being a serious issue. So can you appreciate the fact that to a civilian audience that hasn't engaged in one, doesn't know what it means, this level of death is technically alien to them, and emotionally they can't necessarily, you know, keep up with it, and hence why they are running to such a term like genocide. And then when you combine the fact that the level of destruction of infrastructure and the conditions of Gaza, that's why international media and commentary on some level, is going in that direction?
Yes, I can understand that, Sean. And let me just again contextualize for people. 73,000 who have died out of a population of 2 million over a period of 3 years is 0.02% of the population. That does not qualify as genocide. It qualifies as casualties of war. So I totally understand what you're saying, but I hope that people can contextualize that this is not actual genocide that's happening. Now, let me just bring in a point here for people to understand a little better. Benjamin Netanyahu has been Prime Minister of Israel since 2009, with a short interlude just a couple of years ago where he wasn't. And during that period of time, he was always a very conservative Prime Minister when it came to security. He never rocked the boat with Hamas. He continued to work under the assumption that economic incentives will disincentivize them from terrorism. He understood that the almost every 2-year, like clockwork, Hamas launching rockets into Israel was sort of just a grand gesture and a means to placate their voter base and their constituency of those who support Hamas within Gaza. So there was a level of trust in the existing status quo. And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of people are under the assumption, are saying quite openly that Israel is a warmongering state. Israel has not had a war since 2006, and that was under former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, not under Netanyahu. Netanyahu never launched a war. And so what we're seeing, Sean, in public perception is a disconnect from the reality of what's going on in Israel and what happened to facilitate all of this violence. Now, as a result of October 7th, the Prime Minister Netanyahu decided that, realized probably that the status quo can't be maintained. One of the interesting things is that Yair Sinwar, who was the architect of October 7th, documents have come out and have been recovered where he said he expects an Israeli response of nuclear weapons. Of course, some people speculate that Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel has never confirmed or denied this. But his response was, I hope that they hit us with nuclear weapons. We can all be martyrs. So Israel is not dealing with a rational enemy. It's dealing with an enemy that is girded in an eschatological ideology that is driving their desire to hit Israel, but also hit themselves with no regard for the lives on their side as well. And the reason I bring this up, Sean, is for people to be able to contextualize that the change in the Prime Minister of Israel, in Bibi, Prime Minister Netanyahu, since October 7th has been one that he's realized, one, the status quo can't exist, and two, we need to remove Hamas. This is not just for the benefit of Israel, and I think this is what people are missing. Everyone who's saying free Palestine from the river to the sea, I don't think they have the genuine interest of an average Palestinian child at heart. You saw that video. I also saw that video from last week. I have seen countless videos of these, of kids being indoctrinated into hate, kids growing up with real anger, hatred in their eyes. And I've also seen, Sean, a lot of wonderful initiatives between Israelis and Palestinians at peace. So I just want people to realize that the war that has been launched is one that is an attempt to ensure that Hamas is gone in its entirety. And of course, you can't quickly de-radicalize a population, and 84% of Palestinians, at least in the West Bank, I'm not sure of the exact figures in Gaza, hold anti-Semitic views, virulently anti-Semitic views. So it will take some time, Sean, but the way that the strategy of the Prime Minister and the Defense Forces has changed is that we need to remove Hamas, and that's what we're seeing right now. And it's a slow road, but I think that they have been quite successful. And successful at preserving civilian lives as well.
Okay, so we have some comments that are vehemently disagreeing with you. We'll get to that in a bit because I want to just get a couple of points across, right? First, because I believe I'm in between you and the comments, that's my position, right? Not that I want to be in between you and the comments and to try to defend one side from the other and the other side from the other, but just that's where I stand. So first off, I'd just like to ask your opinion, and this is where now it might be technically outside of your wheelhouse. I understand militarily certain realities that the IDF and Israel faced. I still have an issue with the response because I don't necessarily, the problem is I don't have a reasonable defense from my point of view when people want to speculate with regards to not necessarily genocide. I know that at least right now they're not on pace to wipe out the Palestinians in Gaza, but they are on pace to basically wreck Gaza. And potentially, I could see the then setting the stage for, well, all of a sudden, there's no more Palestine in Gaza, right? Where do the people go? I have no idea. That's been the one sticking point, I think, for everybody. Because, and this part will be relevant in the second point I'll make after, because even Egypt closed their borders, right? So I have an issue with the Israeli response. I don't think it's proportional. We just had a police media ambassador speaking about stand your ground, and one of the things that came up is proportionality. Now, of course, in conflicts between nation states, it's even more complex than you having a conflict with someone trying to burglarize your home, right? But I still find the disproportionate response. I believe in one of the comments that you sent, and I spoke to this on air, you were saying that, well, the people of Palestine needs to be de-radicalized and Hamas is radicalizing them. Their leadership is radicalizing them. But I would argue, and to some degree, the Americans experienced this firsthand, and the French experienced this, you could argue, in Vietnam, and the Russians, the Soviet Union experienced this in Afghanistan. When you remain in a state of conflict long enough, regardless of your rules of engagement, once you have casualties, you will radicalize people. So I don't really see what the objective is, and then because of that, I too have an issue with the amount of deaths. I'm not going to call it a genocide, but similar to a mass casualty shooting, it's still a major wrong. We're not talking about a small figure. Although one could say there are conflicts in recent times with higher casualty numbers, and the inconsistency that I will then have an issue with on the international press is not the attention given to Gaza, but seemingly how is Gaza getting so much attention and parts of Africa doesn't get attention, or other parts of the world doesn't get attention. But with regards to the casualty levels, you know, do you have any insight onto the objectives potentially of Israel? Because I don't see the objectives and the methods I don't see what the objectives are, and I don't see the methods being justified. Casualties are fine, but the level of casualties are still quite high, because it's not quite a civilian police matter, but it's also not a nation versus nation war amongst peers, so to speak, which is what makes it tricky.
And that's what you just said there. It's not a nation to nation. Effectively, it is a nation to nation war. Hamas has been independent. Gaza has been independent since 2005. Israel has withdrawn. They had a choice to make, and unfortunately, the Gazans chose to vote in Hamas, and it has been acting as a de facto independent state. It wasn't just Hamas pelting rocks at Israel. They had an entire arsenal of rockets. And yes, Israel has the Iron Dome, and the Iron Dome has protected lives because Israel has put in this infrastructure to protect its civilians, but it still did penetrate the rockets. Some of the rockets from Hamas did penetrate, and it did have casualties on the Israeli side. And of course, the literal invasion of Israel on October 7th, where Hamas broke down defenses and came in and massacred 1,200 people. So, Sean, the actual result of the war between what I would consider two states, a de facto state of Hamas with a functioning economy, an economy fueled by aid money, which they then channeled into weapons of destruction. It was basically a war between two sovereign entities. Maybe not state entities when you look at Gaza, it's not a state, but it's a de facto sovereign entity. And I understand what you're saying in terms of proportionality to get to that point now. Now, in terms of objectives, as I said, Israel's objective today, post-October 7th, let's just go back to October 6th, 2023. Israel's objective then was let's keep the calm, let's allow money to go into them, and that will keep them quiet, because it was working under the assumption that the leaders of Hamas were rational thinkers. They're not rational thinkers. And so post-October 7th now, Israel realizes it needs to get Hamas out. Now, despite the frictious relationship between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, they are partners. They do work together. From the Israeli perspective, the Palestinian Authority is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but they are the official representatives of the Palestinian people under the Oslo Accords, which Israel is signatory to, and the Palestinian Liberalization Organization is also a signatory to. So I think that Israel is just trying, its objective now, Sean, is to remove Hamas. Now it is moving slowly, because had Israel gone in with a more bullish kind of response, we would have seen higher casualties. And the reason why this war has dragged out is because Israel is trying to minimize civilian deaths at the expense of Israeli civilians and Israeli, of course, IDF soldiers. So I just want you to be aware that the objective is quite clear, that's the objective, is that Israel wants Hamas to be removed. At least from my perspective, Sean, how I am seeing it from where I sit.
I mean, I would agree that this can potentially eliminate heavy artillery. I don't know if it's going to eliminate the threat of terrorism, right? But one thing I will say, people might think, what do you mean they're unreasonable? And this is why I want to tell people, we all make the mistake of assuming that other human beings, yes, they are like us in a lot of ways, but dare I say, most of you go migrate to Japan. Go visit Japan. And yes, they'll be like us. They'll wear clothes like us. Yeah. They'll eat food like us. But it's different food. They'll have different manners at the table. They'll have different cultural sensibilities. They'll view race relations very differently to us. Some of the things they do might be extremely reprehensible if it was done in the context of our own society. So I think we want to project ourselves on everybody else, and we need to understand Europe is not like us. Similar, because we have a lot of influences from Europe. We might have some influences from Africa, some influences from India, and so on and so on. But the Middle East, one could argue certain sensibilities in the Middle East, we just do not have anything close to that here. In fact, we ourselves, some of the people, I find this interesting, who are concerned about the plight of the people of Gaza, are also saying, hey, you see those TNT nationals in the Syrian refugee camps because the husbands went to fight for ISIS? Yeah, let's not let them back in because we don't want the radicalization here. And I'm just like, wait. So when we have skin in the game, we don't want the radicals here. But when we don't have skin in the game, we take it for granted. How bad could the radicals over there be? I'll get to that in a bit because I have a point about that when we go to the comments. I just want to ask, because I find this interesting, Nicholas, you agree with the two-state solution based on the comments that we saw yesterday, which I find interesting because one of our callers, who I believe, other than that, would vehemently disagree with you, vehemently disagree with how you're putting forward your analysis of the situation, but you both agree in the two-state solution, something which I vehemently disagree with because I do believe, I mean, folks, I made the lower third. I put the title that you see the words underneath the screen, never-ending animosity, because in my living memory, it's been consistent. And there's no end in sight, not unless, you know, so many people die that literally the survivors can't remember the fact that they have conflict and hate. So because of that, I don't view the two-state solution being viable, because you need something else that would actually bring peace to then allow the two-state solution to exist. The two-state solution is, to me, what comes after peace, not necessarily what actually brings peace. It might sustain peace, but what will allow for peace has to be some other factor. What would you say to that?
Sean, I agree with what you say. The two-state solution is as a result of peace-building possibilities before. I just want to remind, right, just as much as you said, you know, this has been in your living memory, this animosity has been since then. In 1979, I don't think Israel could have ever imagined its closest Muslim ally, Iran, turning into its most virulent enemy. And vice versa, I don't think Israel could have imagined in 2020 3 Arab states would have come on board to not just forge peace with Israel, but forge a warm, lasting peace that has stood the test of these past 6 years, and specifically the October 7th war. So in my opinion, Sean, nothing is set in stone. When we look at history, who may be our enemy today could end up being our best friend tomorrow. It all depends on the interests of countries. What are they hoping for? Similarly, for the Palestinians, what are they hoping for? What are they aiming for in this moment? There is, of course, a segment of Palestinians whose voices are sadly not being heard, who are advocating for peace with Israel to their very at the risk of their lives. There is a guy, I don't want to share too much about it, but my director of Muslim outreach, her name is Soraya Dean. She's the head of the Muslim Women Speakers Movement in the US. She contacted me about a Gazan man who is, you know, saying, Hamas, you've caused all of this mess. I lay the blame at your feet. And because he has to, you know, all the hiding his face when he speaks and all the other media stuff that has to be done, we're trying to see how we can get him out of Gaza, him and his family, because if it becomes known that he is saying things like this, it will be a problematic thing. And I want to refer to a man called Imri Bunim. Imri is a simple guy from Be'eri, one of the southern towns in Israel. On October 7th, he was forced to fight terrorists with one gun. There were 2 guns in the entire kibbutz. Him and his former commander defended the town, the village. And Imri was on my webinar that my organization hosted, and he said something very clearly. Hamas came in to kill Israelis, and they did. They were successful at that, but they didn't eradicate or kill my desire for peace. What people don't understand is that the southern communities that were attacked on October 7th, those are some of the most left-wing Israelis who believe in peace. And I think, Sean, I'm not sure if this is our last question before we open up for comments, I want people to know that we believe in peace. I believe that peace can happen, and I don't believe that what we're seeing today should be an impediment for hoping for a better tomorrow. It can happen. It will happen, Sean, because the length and breadth of history, this is not a centuries-old conflict by any stretch of the imagination. This began in the 1900s. So there are conflicts today that predate this. China versus Taiwan, for instance. It's not as violent, but it's a conflict nonetheless. So I believe very strongly, Sean, that peace can happen. I agree with you in what you say, that it can't simply, the two-state solution is not going to achieve peace. And I think this is how Israel has also internalized it, is that it needs to be an ongoing process of earned independence for Palestine before it can be a state. Because what? You give it statehood. Trinidad and Tobago, we recognize Palestine as a state, But for what? There is no economy in Palestine. I totally agree with and support a two-state solution, but one which upholds the dignity of Israelis and Palestinians in the right time, Sean.
The thing is, I think part of the narrative with regards to extremism in the Levant included trying to tie things back to the Crusades and that level of period of strife and conflict back then. One of the things that I always found interesting is long before Americans set foot in the Middle East in any significant way, at least outside of the 91 war in Iraq, which they were invited to by Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, was the cry that Americans are bombing their people. And at the time, Americans were yet to have any military presence in the Middle East. It was mainly the Arab states versus Israel throughout, the 1948 and then the 60s and 70s and so on. So I do think the narrative is trying to tie the history of strife, which to some extent is cultural, religious, racial strife that has predated what's going on between Israel and organizations like Hamas. To some extent, one could argue there is a bit of a motivational cultural linkage to the history that feeds in, and it's not just a recent thing, given how I think the situation is viewed. Now, I guess before I go into some other points, let's open up the comments so you could see what some of our viewers are saying. Now, we do have one comment. This is speaking about a different topic going into the situation in the Levant. Good day. How could my government say they are serious about fighting crime when our Prime Minister supported the extrajudicial killing of 180 seafarers by the U.S.? Similarly, the collaboration with the Zionist regime that is exterminating Palestinians. Now, exterminating might be a better word than genocide, might still not necessarily be the most accurate word. But this comment, I'll just say this. The situation with transnational crime is not quite the same as normal law enforcement. However, I do agree they didn't have to kill those people. Arresting them would have been better. Now, that is not an equivalent to what's going on in Israel, where I am forced to now have to view things from both sides in the sense of the level of casualties are quite too high, but at the same time, any military action would have been messy, right? And the problem is Hamas is not innocent. I think I need to remind people that no matter how we view Israel's actions, no matter how bad we think Israel is, Hamas is not innocent. Let's take the next comment. I think it's more direct. Good day. Human Rights Watch, UN Commissioner of Inquiry, UN Special Rapporteur, International Association of Genocidal Scholars, who are mainly Jews, Amnesty International et al. Your guest is spewing Zionist propaganda, playing on people's ignorance. They all attest to Israeli genocide. All right, it might have been better to further explain the point, because I can't debate a claim that has no point. I don't know, Nicholas, if you have a response to this.
I do, very much so. Human Rights Watch, and I see that they say that who are mainly Jews. Entirely untrue. Human Rights Watch has a history of being very anti-Israel. The UN Commission of Inquiry, Albanese, all of these people are quite anti-Semitic. I'm going to say it as it is, right? The viewers may not agree with me, but that is that's the reality. The things that they are saying, the fact that Albanese said there was no sexual violence on October 7th, and has made excuses for them. I don't think that these are as neutral as you may think. The International Association of Genocidal Scholars. Now, this is the one I want to talk about specifically because this is personal to me. This is an organization that allows anyone who can pay $30 to join it and call themselves a genocide, not genocidal, a genocide scholar. This organization has been a hit in the face of actual serious Holocaust and genocide scholarship, because somebody actually went on, I think they put Emperor Palpatine or some fictional character, paid the $30 and was now listed as one of these scholars of genocide. So they are not to be treated as anything serious at all. I'm not spewing. I know that it may seem that I am spewing Zionist propaganda, and I'm not going to get into that. I'm talking about these organizations are not as unbiased as you may think, and are not as expert as you may think in qualifying responses to what is happening in Israel and Hamas.
Let's take our next call. I do have a lot more to add. Good day. Oh my God. Is your guest a clone of Netanyahu or Ben Gvir? No, I think if he was, you would get much more dramatic rhetoric. Just saying. Right? Now, again, if you disagree, I don't know if this is the same commenter, but if you disagreed with Nicholas, then you could state why you disagree, and then we could debate. The previous comment, if it is a different commenter, the previous comment at least pointed to organizations which have different opinions to him, and he was then able to speak on it. We could continue conversation, you could comment again, maybe to respond to his response, but this comment by itself, this is an attack against the speaker, not a meaningful contribution, and it doesn't really help advance dialogue. Let's take the next comment quick. This is a bit more detailed. There's reports of Israeli cooperation in the newspapers and Facebook, and how I want to assess this as a taxpayer is, in terms of relevance and plausible impact to the actual interests of TNT. And your guest has talked about using Israel for Trimegonian interests, so I have 3 tests for them in mind. Now, as of May 2026, the IMF annual country reports are warning TNT is about to have a 10-year shortfall in infrastructure investment, with particular concern for water resilience and excess regulation and logistics issues harming diversification, technology adoption, and business formation. In addition, our health ministry is easily the largest operational header in the budget, currently at $7 billion in direct operating costs alone. This is not a problem, but it is the dominant footprint on the budget and a huge financial headache for every other ministry. These are 3 high-impact priorities in our society, and I was wondering to what extent Israeli cooperation might credibly affect at least one of them. Now, I don't know if this is within your area of expertise, Nicholas, but...
At least, yes. Recently, just last month, the Israeli head of Mashav, which is Israel's developmental outreach organization. Anytime you hear Israel helping countries with water management, with agriculture, any of those things, those are a part of Mashav, which is within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the head of Mashav, Ambassador Einat Schlein, actually came to Trinidad and had several meetings with Trinidadian ministries and ministers to see how Israel could help. Now, that was a very long question. I tried to absorb as much of it as I could, but in terms of the health ministry, Israel did meet with Minister Bodo and is discussing some ways forward to help address some of the gaps in the health ministry as well.
Well, there's also logistic issues, diversification, new technologies, I assume for commercial applications and business. Is there anything there?
Everything is at just a dialogue stage right now. Nothing has happened. I've seen social media posts very far out there with purporting ridiculous things that Israel is buying up land in Trinidad. None of this is at any level of depth right now. It's just everything is at the discussion level, but a very excited discussions are happening.
And the thing is, Israel is essentially on some level, while they have ties to the United States, they are on some level a successful, young, relatively independent nation, right? And because of that, I mean, there was, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a point in time when even the United States treated them like a pariah, and that's when they, unfortunately, you could say, joined with South Africa under apartheid because they were the 2 pariahs of the world. But the point is, they didn't have Big Brother to hold their hand and give them free money and gifts and support throughout their entire history. And that the lessons they learned from that potentially could be applicable to countries like ours in the Caribbean, where that level of independence and ability to apply productivity and new technologies on a smaller scale. We're not looking at what America is doing on that level. We're looking at what smaller countries, Israel is a small country, right? So to develop a smaller country's economy, they might be technically a slightly better example to look at and to learn from. Would you agree?
Definitely. People hear Israel and think it is this massive country. It's only about 2.5 times the size of Trinidad, 2.5 to 3 times the size of Trinidad. It's very tiny, and it's a country that has had to make do with nothing. A lot of the Israeli technology, now we could look back at things in hindsight and say, okay, I can see this, so this is what I'm doing now. A lot of Israel's, the problems that it faced with its enemies all around it, forced the country to become the powerhouse of innovation that it is today. And it wants to bring that to Trinidad and Tobago for many different reasons. As I said, the two countries have had a relationship since the very start of Trinidad's independence. The current government is, of course, very willing to listen. I also think the way that where we are at in Trinidad right now, to refer to that last comment, we're in a very dire position. We need diversification. Actually, a minister, I can't remember who it was, recently said that we've had diversification. Diversification has not been the issue. The issue has been investing in and implementing diversification in Trinidad. So all of the governments have had all of the government ministers have had great ideas, but they've not been able to take it forward in any meaningful way. So that is what Israel wants to help do in Trinidad. And I think this is very altruistic of Israel. And I know people may have their ideas. Oh, Israel is this big bad wolf, etc., etc. Israelis, I've seen terrible comments. They will want to come and take over Trinidad. There is no example in history or in our times of Israel taking over anyone's land. The West Bank remains under the authority of the Palestinian, the authority of the Palestinian Authority in the areas as clearly agreed upon by Israel and the Palestinians. And Israel has withdrawn from Lebanon. Hezbollah has encroached back into those territories. You talked yesterday, Sean, about having an international peacekeeping force. Those have proven to be complete failures, abject failures.
Oh, I know.
Specifically in South Africa.
I know, but when you look at a lot of the examples, I can't remember I think it was in Africa where they had like an Irish force that was under-equipped. I know there was a different, the Irish force I'm speaking about, or Welsh, or I can't remember exactly. That was sometime in the 70s. In more recent times, there was a Chinese peacekeeping force. They were woefully underprepared and under-equipped and outgunned by the forces that they were supposed to keep separate. You had the situation in Somalia that was immortalized in the book and the movie Black Hawk Down, which gives a reasonable account of the situation. And you see the politics intruding and not having a full understanding on the mission. I know that peacekeeping missions have failed, usually because they fail from implementation. It's just that, now here's the thing, there is some silver lining, because to my understanding, the leadership of Lebanon, is it Lebanon? They are looking to get rid of Hezbollah. How effective they are doing that, at least I don't know if they're still on that stance. That was some time ago when I saw those reports. How effective the government of Lebanon might be at doing that may vary, right? And while I'm not saying they should ask Israel for assistance, maybe foreign assistance from Europe or America might do them well. But of course, the revolutionaries might use that as cannon fodder, as ammunition. This is something that people need to understand. Mr. Jagdeo, I assume you're aware, of course, of the situation known as Black September?
Yes.
And that was basically, the PLO was in Jordan in the 70s and effectively started a civil war in Jordan, wanting to bring about revolution in Jordan. Is that correct?
Yes.
So this is one of the things when I say there's reasons why the Arab world doesn't want to take in Palestinians. Because I believe it might have been 79. They eventually had to kick out the PLO from their country because the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, they wanted a revolution in Jordan. Jordan was, correct me if I'm wrong, not an ally of Israel at the time, right? In fact, they recently would have actively engaged in hostilities with Israel. Jordan is one of the countries that historically, at that time period, 60s and 70s, had multiple armed conflicts with Israel, correct?
Yes.
So that's why I say this situation is not as straightforward as people want to make it out to be. Now, if we go to peace with regards to the level of animosity in the situation, I believe in the 80s, it was President Nasser, I could be wrong on the name, of Egypt. He wanted peace with Israel after, I think it was at least 3 wars, right?
It was President Nasser had launched wars against Israel, and then President Anwar Sadat came in and forged peace with Israel in 1979.
Right, but then he was killed, right? He was assassinated.
Yes, Sadat was assassinated. Yes.
Because he went for peace with Israel.
Yes.
Another historical fact that again points to the fact that this is not, don't assume that everybody involved thinks like us. Basically, they were so angry with him making peace with Israel, somebody killed him for it, correct?
Yes, you're absolutely right.
And now let's open up the phone lines for it. So if we could, I hopefully they'll let me go on along. But this is the last point I want to make. And this is why, while I disagree with Israel, and I cannot condone 70,000 casualties, right? No matter how relatively low they are when considering a major military action. At the same time, this is the modern phenomenon that takes the cake for me with regards to the news narrative and the political narrative in modern times over this issue. Nicholas, what do you make of this whole movement known as Queers for Palestine?
It's something that is quite confusing. The average LGBTQIA Palestinian is running across to Israel for safe haven, and they're given that in Israel. They're given asylum in Israel. The average Lebanon is a little bit different, but there's quite a number of Lebanese gays, queers who end up in Israel as a place of refuge. Israel is a country that respects human rights and respects life, so it does extend that to people around who don't unfortunately have that where they live. And so it's very confusing to me that there is a group of people who would do something like that and champion radical Islam. And just to be clear, Israel is not fighting Islam. It is fighting radical Islam. Sean, if you don't mind me just saying one thing that came out in what you were saying before, as people are trying to make sense of this situation, I don't think people have spent enough time trying to understand the Israeli mindset. One of the reasons you asked me to come on is because of my background, partially because of my background in Holocaust and genocide studies. And I think a lot of people...
Can you stick a pin in that? Because we do have a call that they mentioned just before you were speaking. So let's take the call now. Shogunas on the line. Caller, good morning. You on the air?
Yes, I'm on the air.
Yes, go ahead, caller.
Okay, so I want to address the issue of the two-state solution. I'm a good friend of Nicholas, and I think that Nicholas is all for peace, and he's an optimist. And I think, it is good to seek peace with the Palestinians because there is a history of Israel being at war with several nations. Of course, Sean, you mentioned with Sadat and with Egypt and with Jordan, who were formerly at war, but now there is peace and so on. So there is a level of optimism. But I think at this time, a two-state solution is not viable because there is not a negotiable partner. There is not a workable partner. The Palestinians, at least I wouldn't say the Palestinians, but the radical, ruling, most influential section of the society is not for a two-state solution. And so therefore there is not a viable option on the table. They're not talking about that continent. There is this whole ideology of from the river to the sea that the Jews must leave. So until this radical have been eradicated, until this radical ideology, and I'm not saying to kill them all, but unless by some means it be removed from a generation or be removed from their minds, there will not be a two-state solution. As long as these ruling, and I say it may be a minority of the Palestinians, but for all intents and purposes, it is the most influential minority minority, and this is the minority that is dangerous, because those who believe that there should be a two-state solution, they may be on the ground and they have absolutely no influence whatsoever. This group that doesn't believe in a two-state solution, they are the group that is influential. They are the group that is calling the shots. They are the group that has the guns and the weaponry and so on. So presently within the region, I think Israel has proven to make a workable society. As a matter of fact, there are 2 million Arabs, right? There are 2 million Arabs in Israel living and sharing the same rights, of course, with many different contentions and variables and so on. But the whole thing about it is that Israel has proven that they can work with the Arabs rather than the other way around. There are not a whole lot of Israeli Jews living among the Arabs, living among the Palestinians, so-called Palestinians, right? And so therefore I believe that the two-state solution is not viable at the moment. It is not tenable at the moment until you can remove this radical ideology from within the so-called Palestinian people.
Thank you, caller. Just note, Lebanon is not directly controlled by Hezbollah, whereas Gaza is directly controlled by Hamas, and I think that's a significant difference in the two areas of Palestine. Also, just a side note, when people say they want to take over our land, there's a very big difference between maybe annexing neighboring land and looking to annex a Caribbean island half a world away. And that's when I know that whoever says those things doesn't fully understand how these things actually work. Now, with that said, Nicholas, you were talking about maybe locals understanding Israel better before we took the call.
Yes, very quickly. I think that a lot of people try to understand how Palestinians think, but I'm coming to you as a Holocaust scholar. I think we need to contextualize how Israelis think. It's just a generation ago that the Holocaust occurred. And of the Holocaust, I don't think people are able to fully contextualize what that was. Yes, they may know 6 million Jews died, but they don't realize that the figure represents 1/3 of the world's Jewish population. So by the end of 1945, 1 in every 3 Jews was dead. And of course, there were Jewish communities around the world, many who were not European and did not directly experience the Holocaust, but this is part of being a society and a nation, is that the experiences become a commonality. It becomes the heritage of the nation. So even for Middle Eastern Jews, who now comprise about more than half of Israel's population, the Holocaust and the reverberating effects of the Holocaust impact Israel. It impacts its responses. This is a community of people who a generation ago lost 1/3 of their people. So this is what I want viewers to contextualize. You may think, oh, Israel is just this crazy country. No, it's a country of trauma. It's a country that has experienced not just the Holocaust, but genocides of persecution around the world. So you have to be able to realize that the Israeli response is always one of existentialism. It's always one that we are trying to live. And we will achieve that as best as we can to minimize other sufferings. But our responsibility is for our safekeeping and the preservation of us as a people.
Before I make the last point that I want to make, you mentioned yesterday of growing anti-Semitism in TNT. And I want you to speak about that because I have heard of a case. And when I say anti-Semitism, we ain't talking about people blaming rich Jews that control the economy, right? Like how you blame the 1%. We're talking about full-on people saying very interesting things. I'll let you say it. I'll let you say it because I don't want to speak for you. I don't have the same level of experience or witnessing of these things that you do. What have you seen locally?
Just very quickly, let's anchor this into a definition. Anti-Semitism is the irrational hatred of the Jewish people. That does not have to exemplify itself in mass killings. It is just a hatred that is based on stereotypes and really misconceptions. There is right now shown in Trinidad a white a silver Surrey station wagon driving around with the Nazi swastika, specifically a Nazi swastika with the eagle on it, driving around Trinidad. My organization did report it to the police. Unfortunately, we have no laws against that in Trinidad. The police were very sympathetic, but there was nothing they could do about it. Since October 7th, and anyone driving down streets in Trinidad, the highway specifically, will see, I hope it's gone, I haven't really looked or noticed, but a lot of anti-Semitic comments. F Netanyahu, Satanyahu, all of these things. That is anti-Semitic.
Well,
if you don't like...
Well, I mean, those things, I understand they're anti-Semitic, but it's a different level to approaching support for Nazism.
Say again?
It's a different level to when you see people either supporting or having messages that are close to what we saw in Nazi Germany.
Yes. And so we're seeing that in social media comments, Hitler was right. Hitler should have finished the job. This is why they've been kicked out of every, they being the Jews, been kicked out of every country. You know, the blood libel that Jews have used Christian blood in the making of matzah, which is a Jewish unleavened bread at Passover. They're coming here to take our kids. All of these things, it's quite alarming that a country that a generation ago welcomed Jews in, and a country that prides itself as being here, every creed and race find an equal place, is now one that is actively spewing anti-Semitism. And I'm not saying it's all of society.
Yeah.
Of course, it's segments of our society, but it's very alarming that this is happening in Trinidad. And if I could just say one thing, Sean.
We do have a caller, so quick.
Say again?
We do have a caller, so quick.
Okay, yeah, I'll end there.
Okay, so Mr. San Fernando on the line. This should be interesting, I believe, Mr. San Fernando. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Sean. Good morning, Nicholas.
Morning.
Nicholas, let me ask you a question firstly. So disclosure. Are you an Israeli citizen?
I'm not sure why that is necessary.
You come on a public forum to as a head of a particular organization, and I think full disclosure is necessary. It should have been disclosed at the beginning of the program. Are you not an Israeli citizen?
No.
Okay, great. Because and let me tell you why I'm asking this question. Because I have listened to your contribution. I like a lot of what you're saying, eh? Don't think I am. This is about aggression. I'm calling about to chastise you. However, when I listen to your discourse, when you're speaking about Israel, you're always saying we. And that is why I asked the question. You're saying a lot of the times in your discourse you're saying we. Hence the reason why anybody reasonably listening to this program would think that you are sympathetic towards the Israeli cause only. This is a constructive criticism, and as I said, I'm not calling you here to fight. Now, you talk about the Hamas, right? Because Hamas is separate from the Palestinian people in a real sense, and I agree with some of what you're saying about Hamas. However, on the Israeli side, there are right-wing people, politicians in Israel that do not want this thing to a two-state solution to succeed. You agree with me?
Yes.
Right. So, how do we bridge the gap? Because like you, I really want this thing to end. I really want to see a prosperous Israel and a prosperous Palestinian country. It seems as if, how do we work around these two radical segments? Because on the Israeli side, these are radical forces are the ones that in power. Netanyahu, before Netanyahu, a lot of them. Why it is that on the Israeli side, they are so vehement with not wanting a two-state solution. And those are the people who are leading the Knesset. Could you explain that to the audience?
I'm happy. I'm guessing this is the same caller from yesterday, right? I kind of recognize the voice. It's a great statement that you make there, but Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, and I'm not sure if many Trinidadians understand the complexity of Israeli politics. They don't have one party leading the country. It's always been a coalition. The country is very, very, it allows, the way the system is set up, it allows for multiple parties to get into the Knesset, and so there are coalitions that always happen. Yes, this is the most right-wing government in Israeli history, as far as I'm aware. However, Benjamin Netanyahu, with his second time he became prime minister in 2009, by 2010 he had endorsed the two-state solution publicly. I don't know if he actually believes in it privately, but at least publicly he has endorsed it, and it remains something that his party is party to. Now, you're talking about particular extremists within the Israeli government, and they are small parties, and they're not representative of the entire Israeli society or the future governments. Who knows what could happen in October when elections happen? But I don't think that Israeli extremism is something that can be looked at without considering as well, just as Sean said in the beginning, Palestinians can become radicalized. Not just Palestinians, anybody can become radicalized with constant attacks. Similarly, I think that's what's given rise to extremism in Israel, and the rise of the extreme right in Israel. So it is of particular concern, of course, and I think within Israel there are a lot of there is a lot of opposition, and there are a lot of political forces at play trying to eradicate this extremist voice that's currently sitting in the government. I don't know, and I can't effectively speak on what will be, but I do know that the majority of Israeli society, as we saw pre-October 7th, out on the streets marching for Israeli democracy, are very against having voices like that representing them. Because somebody like you, Mr. San Fernando, I don't know your name, but someone like you in Trinidad and Tobago can look at what Minister Ben-Gvir or Minister Smotrich says and say, oh, this is what Israel thinks. And for the majority of Israelis, that's not what they think at all. They are too small parties hosting very small number of seats in the Knesset, but they managed to make it through because of coalition building.
Yeah, just saying, Israel is, by all accounts, a very progressive society, despite the radical conservative elements. Just look at the LGBTQ acceptance in the country. That is pertinent to the point that I want to make, but before I make that point, we have a caller on the line. Hopefully this is the last caller so I can make my point, because we have to end soon. Caller, good morning, you're on the air.
Yes, pleasant morning.
Morning.
A former caller, I don't know if it was his intent, but he seemed to be making the point that there is extremism on the side of Israel, there is extremism on the side of the Palestinians, and somehow he attempts to equate them as they are at loggerheads. I think you're comparing chalk with cheese here, because on the level of extremism that is on the Israel side, no matter how far right they are, it is nothing to compare with what is happening with the extremism on the Palestinian side. They have openly stated in their charter that their aim is to the eradication of the nation of Israel, right? The Hamas leaders have come out and said that they have revised it, but this is their stated aim. They even said that they're gonna perpetuate October 7 again and again and again. Israel extremism is seen in the way they treat the Palestinians. They have the firepower to obliterate all of the Palestinians, to obliterate everybody in Hamas, to level the place. But yet they're going through and they're nitpicking, and they're trying to still at least, and coming out of the statistics that the speaker, Nicholas, had given, he had already stated that when you compare the figures that have died over the period of 3 years, is 0.03 something. right, that has died. So there is no need to talk about extremism on the side of Israel. You had people jumping in the streets while Israeli bodies were being dragged to the street. There was no dissenting voice against what Hamas was doing when they took Israeli citizens and abducted them and carried them in the streets. You will never find Israelis rejoicing. If you bring Palestinians and you're tormenting them in the streets, you will not find a caucus of people from Israel.
Okay.
So you cannot compare the two extremes to say in any way that it's something similar. Yes, but
Okay. Sorry, no, we're out of time, so I'll have to end it there. I get your point. I'll just say this. It's not about comparison, and I think that's my point, because that's what people want to do with regards to the casualty figures. And I'm saying don't compare Israel's casualties of 1 to 2,000 to Palestinian casualties and say, well, the Palestinians must be innocent and the Israelis must be guilty. And similarly, I'm not about to compare levels of extremism. It doesn't matter to me which one is more. I'm concerned about extremism on a whole, because the minor extremism in Israel could then be the spark that ignites the flame of continuing the conflict, and it doesn't have to be a lot of casualties, right? The assumption is it's going to be someone like from Hamas or an organization like that that's going to keep the fighting going. But not necessarily. It doesn't have to be. So it's not about the greater evil justifies the lesser evil. Wrong is wrong, and in things like this, and it's similar to our politics. The fact that one political party is less corrupt doesn't make them not corrupt. It still makes them corrupt. So it's not about comparison. It's literally pointing out the issues that could exist on both sides. And these are potential stumbling blocks to peace. Yes, I agree with you. They have stated their goal is the destruction of Israel. Obviously, we haven't necessarily seen that coming out of Israel by any group out of Israel. But that doesn't mean that the extremism cannot be a potential destabilizing force. All right. The last point I want to make, Nicholas, I don't know if you have anything else to add before I just make this last point.
No, thank you, Sean.
Okay, so this is the thing. Israel accepts LGBTQ people, and for the most part, religious extremism does not. So despite the fact that there are religious conservatives in Israel, their society accepts it. We have seen pushback in our own society against LGBTQ people. And we have seen the consequences of being LGBTQ in conservative religious societies in the Middle East. Let me put it that way. Now, here's the thing. This is an interesting phenomenon that I've seen more and more in America. This is but one example. In August 2026, Washington State congressional candidate Melissa Chauncey faced criticisms and calls from groups like the Washington State Stonewall Democrats to rescind endorsements after admitting she intentionally omitted LGBTQ rights from her platform. Her explanation was this: a lot of Muslims do not feel that way, unfortunately. Now, it's not that it's an issue I have with Muslims. It's an issue I have with the politics. I understand religious conservatism. That's fine, right? But when the politicians now play to that, it comes across as something disingenuous. Because for the entire time before October the 7th, you had this progressive, seemingly unified coalition of everybody under the sun. That's why you had something like Queers for Palestine. And no one necessarily within that sphere considered the fact that there are a lot of competing interests that disagree with each other. And one of those things are religious conservative Muslims and LGBTQ rights. And the politicians are not here to genuinely try to bring people together, to foster goodwill and unity. No, they're here to say, oh, well, you're a bigger support base, or you're a bigger issue, so I'm going to give you more credence and precedence. And when you understand that's the type of thinking with regards to Western politics on things like this, then you have to question exactly what is the motivation for some of the narratives. Because literally, we have a situation where at least one politician, and there are other examples in different ways, is basically saying, all right, some of you, your cause is going to have to take a back seat because politically this is more important to me. not what is right or what is wrong. Because again, it's not about attacking conservative religious people. It's about how politics and then the news media takes that in and takes advantage of those causes when it suits them. When LGBTQ rights suited their political agenda, they took advantage of the cause. Now, in some quarters of America, it's seemingly there are those who think it's not as important for their agenda. So they're going to have them take a back seat. And if you want to base your principles on political narratives like that, it's going to be extremely inconsistent and based on a foundation made but of sand. And it will fall apart once challenged by any meaningful means or way. So, Mr. Jagdeo, are you still with me? I don't know if you have anything else to add to that before we go. This has the last word.
Sure, no, I don't have anything to add. The rain has just come down pouring, so I can't hear you too well. But I just want to say thank you so much for the very, very great conversation. Thank you to the callers who called in. I hope I did add some nuance and a different perspective to this situation. And Sean, I'll be glad to come back on at any other time as well.
Well, thank you for reaching out, and it was a good discussion. I appreciate you willing to face the fire of the national audience. And folks, I understand you could disagree with Mr. Jagdeo, with Nicholas Jagdeo. I don't have an issue with that. We don't have to all agree eye to eye, just as long as the conversations are civil and we're able to try to make a genuine effort to understand each other. Because at the end of the day, I still disagree with certain things with regards to Israel, but I appreciate the conversation and the greater understanding that I have on the issue. It's a complex issue, and I don't have all the answers. And perhaps we should be careful how we want to commit to absolute and extreme statements while not necessarily being fully informed of all the pertinent details. Just saying. All right, thanks to Mr. Jagdeo once again, folks. This is Talking About WSN, Content Capital. Again, a little over time, but I wanted to let this topic ventilate a bit. Thanks to all of the guys behind the scenes for allowing me to continue for so long, both today and yesterday. That said, remember your allegiance to the Republic and to each other. And that last part, maybe I'll emphasize this time more today. Right? We are all Trimbegonians, and we could very easily be separated on a whole host of issues. We've seen it around the world. We are doing it to ourselves, but are we Trimbegonian first, or do we put some other allegiance before that? Stay safe. Threats against society notwithstanding, still do everything to keep yourself safe within reason in your everyday life so we could see each other tomorrow. Bye-bye.
WESN